The following story is told from a female's perspective. At the time, I was around 16 or 17 years old. My then boyfriend and I decided that we'd go camping. We camped out in a small patch of woods next to a neighborhood that was being developed. It was roughly about 1,000 feet across in both directions. To the left, facing the road, lay the undeveloped neighborhood. To the right, there was a long, desolate driveway that led to a house nestled just over half a mile past our campsite. As the sun began to set, we set up our campsite with a tent, a fire pit, sleeping bags, and a few chairs. We then roasted marshmallows, shared stories, and told a few jokes around the campfire. As we began to settle down, we heard a loud, blood-curdling scream that was abruptly cut off. We both froze in fear, our eyes darting in the direction we heard the screams. All we could see was darkness and thick woods, rendering the source invisible. My boyfriend wasted no time. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator sounded a bit skeptical, believing the noise we heard was a wild cat in heat. Regardless, they assured us they would send out a few police units to check it out. Minutes later, we heard a gunshot piercing through the woods. It was unmistakable and sent us into a panicked frenzy. We left behind our camping gear and started running in the direction of our car. As we reached, we both jumped in, locking the doors behind us. We struggled to catch our breath, trying to process the situation. Eventually, we saw a man emerging from the woods, dragging something wrapped in heavy sheets or cloth. He spotted us and immediately dropped what he was dragging. He then reached into his pants and pulled out a gun. I immediately fumbled with my keys, trying to get them into the ignition, all while ducking my head. As soon as I started the car, I heard a loud bang, followed by shattered glass falling over my head. I looked over to my right, only to see my boyfriend had a large gaping wound in his arm. I screamed and put the car in reverse, flooring it out of there. More gunshots rang out, piercing through our windows. I then heard the sounds of police sirens blazing in the distance. The gunshots had stopped at this point, and I peered up to see the man running into the woods, leaving behind the large wrapped bundle of sheets. As the police arrived, 2 of the officers ran in pursuit behind the man, while a 3rd officer stood by us, calling for backup and an ambulance. My boyfriend was losing a lot of blood from his arm. The officer took out a long cloth and tied it around my boyfriend's arm to stop the bleeding. While waiting for the ambulance, we explained our accounts of what happened to the officer. He stood by us and wrote a report until the paramedics and backup arrived. I accompanied my boyfriend in the ambulance, and thankfully, he was able to make a full recovery. Later on, we found out that the man had taken his wife out into those woods and killed her because she was cheating on him with a co-worker. Once the police caught up to him, he put the gun he had to his head and pulled the trigger. This was by far the most horrifying experience I've ever had, and although my boyfriend and I split up since then, we still remain close friends to this day. So to the man that took the life of his wife and almost took ours, let's never meet again. It was a late November in Colorado, and I was around 7 or 8 years old. My father had the idea of taking us all for a weekend to a cabin in the woods. My mother thought it was a great idea for the family to bond, so that's exactly what happened. We rented a cabin for a few days, and my sister and I took a Friday off from school to get a head start on getting there. Once we arrived, we got everything set up and decided where each of us would be sleeping. We had dinner and prepared for bed, thinking about what we'd do the next day. Since we arrived a bit late, there wasn't much we could do on the first night. That night, I heard noises outside that sounded like footsteps. I looked out the window and saw nothing, so I figured it might be an animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but about 15 minutes later, I heard it again. I woke up my sister, who was about 11 at the time, and she heard it as well. We both walked over to the window and saw something outside, but we weren't quite sure what it was. We decided it would be best if it didn't see us, so we went back to sleep. My sister and I both had trouble sleeping that night, but eventually, we both fell asleep. When we woke up the next morning, my mother was preparing breakfast in the kitchen while my father was outside. I asked my mum if I could go outside with my dad, and she said yes. My sister decided to stay with my mum and wait for her to finish breakfast. As I walked outside, I saw my father talking to a man. He was short, overweight, had a shaved head, and was wearing a veteran's cap. He appeared a bit nervous, with sweat dripping from his face, even though it was practically freezing outside. I walked over to them, and my father introduced me as his son. The man looked at me and said, "Nice to meet you, kid. My name is Patrick." He smiled and looked at me. I smiled back and greeted him. It might have been considered rude at the time, but I was just a kid. I asked him, "You look kinda scared, are you alright?" He coughed and replied, "Yeah, I'm fine. Just went through shell shock. I'm a veteran." I could tell my father really liked this guy, and he seemed like a nice guy at first too. He told my father he had also rented a cabin nearby with his family and decided to introduce himself. My father invited him inside for breakfast, and we all sat down to eat. Afterward, I went out to play while my father and Patrick continued talking outside. While playing, I fell and scraped my knee. By that point, it was just me and Patrick outside. My father had gone inside after my mum called for his help. Patrick ran over to me and told me to come with him to his cabin because he had band-aids. I stupidly agreed and went with him. We walked and talked for a bit, and I told him about all my hobbies and what I liked doing for fun. Then, things got a bit weird. He asked me how old I was and what shoe size I wore. I didn't know my shoe size, but I told him my age. He just kind of chuckled and said something like, "Good to know." Also, his cabin was nowhere near ours. It was deep in the woods, taking about 20 to 25 minutes to walk there. I was tired, and there was no point in getting the band-aid anymore, but I kept going since I'd walked so long already. We entered the cabin, and he told me to go in first, so I did. As soon as I walked in, I realized something was amiss. There was nobody else there, contrary to what he had mentioned about his family. I asked him where his family was, but he didn't answer, pretending not to hear me. He then locked the door behind us, and I got frightened. He told me, "I'll be right back with the band-aid, kiddo." He walked into the kitchen, retrieved a band-aid, then returned, telling me to take a seat. I sat down, and he put the band-aid on my knee, holding my leg with one hand while rubbing it up and down with the other. He then said, "You're rather muscular, kid. I like that." I got scared and stood up immediately. He asked me what was wrong, and I said nothing, just that my leg felt much better now. I thought my parents must be worried sick about me, so I wanted to hurry back. He insisted that I stay a little longer and eat there. I didn't want to stay, but I was alone and uncertain if I could find my way back to our cabin if I tried to run. The door was locked, so I agreed to eat with him quickly so I could leave faster. He asked me how much I weighed, and I guessed around 73 pounds. He then had a smile spread across his face, nodding and saying, "Perfect weight." Confused, I asked him, "Perfect for what?" But he just kept smiling. I was really weirded out and asked him again if I could go. He told me no, that things were just getting started and I shouldn't miss out on the fun. I then heard a loud bang come from the bedroom where the door was closed. Patrick stood up quickly, appearing a bit angry. He walked into the room and slammed the door behind him. I then heard him yelling something like, "Did I fucking tell you that you could move? Stay the hell where you are. I'm having fucking company." He then walked out with a smile on his face and shut the door slowly, saying, "Sorry about that. It was just my wife. She's really sick and not allowed to be near visitors today." I wanted to leave even more now. I looked around the room and noticed there were clothes everywhere. It was really messy. It seemed like he had been living out of this cabin. At that moment, his wife walked out of the bedroom saying that she was hungry. Patrick looked furious. "Get back in there," he said angrily. His wife was extremely pale and looked like she had been crying a lot. She was sniffing and had dark circles around her eyes. She looked at me briefly, then walked back in the room. I then asked Patrick where his kids were, but he didn't answer. He told me he had some kids' clothes he wanted me to try on. That was the last straw for me. I had to get out of that situation but didn't know how. I started crying, and he hugged me saying, "It'll be okay, little one. Nothing is going to happen. Just try on these clothes." He walked toward the back room, and that's when I took my opportunity. I unlocked the front door and tried to sneak out as quietly as I could. I didn't care if I got lost in the woods anymore. I just didn't want to take any more chances with Patrick, if that even was his real name. I felt like he had been lying about everything. Outside now, trying to find my way back, I was still close enough to Patrick's cabin to hear shouting. I heard him yelling at his wife, saying things like, "Where the hell did he go? I knew I shouldn't have left him alone." I'm pretty sure I heard him call her a whore and bitch a few times too. Then, something happened that terrified me. I stopped in my tracks when I heard footsteps nearby. I hid behind a tree and looked toward the cabin. Patrick was outside, looking around for something, or someone. I saw him step into the woods, shouting things like, "Hey kid, it's okay. You don't have to try on the clothes. I have toys back in my cabin if you just come back." I then ran as fast as I could in a straight line, hoping to find my family's cabin. I was running away and thought I heard more shouting, but I didn't stop. After what seemed like hours of running, I saw a cabin in the distance, my family's cabin. I ran to it and found my dad outside looking around for me. I ran up to him crying and told him that Patrick was a creep and that he tried to kidnap me. My dad immediately called the person he rented the cabin from, who said no one else had rented it. My dad told me to never follow strangers again. We left right away and got a refund for the next night. The owner called the police. They checked out Patrick's cabin but didn't find him or his supposed wife, though their belongings were still there. The police asked us some questions, then left. We haven't heard an update on the situation since then. Patrick probably wasn't even the creepy man's real name, and I doubt he was really a veteran either. I still wonder what happened to him and his wife, how he even got a wife, and why they were living in that cabin. It seemed like they had been there a while. My assumption is that he left once he realized cops were coming, especially since he wasn't supposed to be there. So, to the creepy cabin man that tried to kidnap me, let's never meet again. During my sophomore year of high school, my best friend and her dad invited me to go on a camping trip in Arizona. Her dad owned a cabin several miles off the highway that was close to a few camping and fishing spots. For privacy reasons, we'll call my friend Olivia and her dad Andrew. We left home for the 6-hour drive and made it to the cabin just before sundown. Due to the approaching darkness, all we could do that day was make a fire and cook some dinner. That night, Andrew told us about all the trails he had planned for us to backpack and camp on. Olivia and her dad were fairly experienced campers and would go on 2-week camping trips every summer. They had camped everywhere from the Rockies to Appalachia. We finished dinner and talked until the fire died down. It was dark, almost pitch black, with the only source of light coming from the full moon above us. Andrew said it was time for bed and handed each of us a flashlight. We followed him into the cabin where we'd stay the night. The cabin was very rustic, as it had no running water or electricity. Andrew shut the door and hung a battery-powered lantern on the ceiling as we got ready for bed. We woke up at dawn the next morning, packed our backpacks, and headed up the trail. After hiking for a few hours, we finally reached the campsite. It was a beautiful lake surrounded by peaks on all sides. There was a flat area where we could set up our tent and make camp. We spent the whole day fishing and exploring the area around the campsite. It really was a therapeutic experience. Andrew taught me how to fish, and we even caught a few that we were able to cook that night. It was easily one of the best days I've had in over a year, but what I didn't expect is that it would be one of the last peaceful days I'd have for a long time. The next day, we began packing to move on to the next campsite. About halfway down, we stumbled upon some edible berry bushes. We spent a few minutes picking the berries while Andrew set his bag down and told us he would go take a leak. He moved about 10 steps behind a large tree to relieve himself. Once he left our line of sight, the atmosphere changed. The best way I can describe it is that everything went still. No birds chirping, no wind. It became dead silent. An eerie feeling washed over me, and I knew there was something wrong. After a few minutes, Olivia called out for her dad, but there was no reply. We quickly walked behind the tree, only to find that Andrew was gone. Not only was the tree completely dry, but there were no footprints leading away from the tree, and no sign that Andrew had been standing there in the first place. We began to panic and called out his name at the top of our lungs, but there was no response. Appalled, I looked at Olivia and asked what the hell just happened. By this point, the atmosphere had returned to normal, but Andrew was nowhere to be found. I picked up his backpack and left mine behind, as he had more useful supplies in his. We spent the next several minutes looking around the area where he disappeared, but still, there was no trace of him. I asked Olivia what our next course of action should be. She said that we needed to call for help, but the problem was that we didn't have cell phones. She then remembered that her dad's truck had a radio we could use to call for help. The only problem was that we had to hike our way back to the cabin to get to it. After deciding that this was our best course of action, we began heading down the mountain as quickly as we could. During our descent, the weather abruptly changed and a heavy rainstorm ensued. We stepped off the trail for a moment and used the tarp from the tent as a makeshift umbrella. It rained for a good 45 minutes, and as quickly as the rain came, the clouds were broken by sunlight. We took the tarp off of us and proceeded with our journey. Just ahead of us, there was a small clearing in the forest, illuminated by beams of light shining between the clouds. We saw a herd of deer come out of the other side of the clearing. I looked over at Olivia and noticed her face turned pale. She looked at me and said, "Matthew, what's wrong with those deer?" I took a second look and noticed that there was something off about them. The best way I can describe it is that their movements lacked the grace that deer typically have in their steps. These deer had stiff and almost mechanical movements. Their eyes also resembled the eyes of a human. Olivia then said something that to this day I will never forget. "The feet, Matthew." I looked at the feet of one of the deer and saw that these deer lacked the cloven hooves that deer and elk have, but instead had canine paws. As I realized this, one of the deer raised its head and looked me dead in the eyes. My fight or flight response instantly kicked in. I grabbed Olivia's hand and pulled her with me. We ran away from the clearing as fast as we could. Once we made a safe distance, we stopped to catch our breath. My whole life, I'd known Olivia as my fearless friend. But at this moment, for the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. She finally opened her mouth and said, "We need to leave." She started down the trail faster than I could respond. I followed her, and eventually we reached the cabin. Luckily, her dad had left the keys to the truck on his bed. We called the Forest Service, and they came to pick us up. They took us to their local headquarters. Once we reached there, we told the ranger what happened. Of course, he came up with a logical explanation that Andrew probably got lost. We tried to explain to him that there was more to it, and we even brought up the deer we encountered. The ranger just brushed it off as the forest playing tricks on us, and gave us a lecture on how easy it is to get lost in the forest. They launched a search for Andrew that lasted about 2 weeks. My dad came to pick us up, and we all stayed in a hotel for the duration of the search. After the 2-week search, still, nothing had turned up. A few months later, Olivia's grandparents got a call saying that they found remains on a trail that matched Andrew's description. As terrible as the news was, it gave us closure to finally know the truth. Something that bothers me to this day is the fact that the body was found on a trail several miles away from the one he disappeared on. We still haven't gotten a proper explanation as to why the body was found so far away, or even the circumstances leading up to the recovery. It's been over 10 years since this happened, and after all of this, Olivia and I are celebrating a year of being married. Despite being so close to her, this is still a topic that we rarely discuss, and after 10 years, she still refuses to speak about the deer. I hope that one day, I'll find the answers to all of my questions, and when that day does come, I'll definitely post an update. Thank you all for watching. Before you leave, don't hesitate to drop a like and leave feedback down below in the comments. By the way, it's surprising to see that half of you guys that watch my videos aren't subscribed yet. If you love the content and don't want to miss any future uploads, make sure to smash that subscribe button and enable the bell notifications. This way, you'll be notified every time I upload. Thanks again, and sweet dreams.